An old man sat shivering on the cold pavement outside a glittering office tower. His clothes were torn, his hair unkempt, his hands trembling. The people passing by didn't know that behind the disguise was a billionaire father, testing the kindness of his only son. When the son finally arrived, his words were like knives, words that would shatter his father's heart and expose a truth no wealth could hide. The pavement was hard, the winter air sharp as broken glass, and the old man sat hunched with a paper cup between his calloused hands. His voice, hoarse and trembling, whispered a plea. "Spare some change, sir." The young man in the tailored suit didn't even glance down. He stepped around the frail figure as though he were nothing more than a stain on the sidewalk. But the world did not know. This was not a beggar. This was Charles Whitmore, a man whose name was etched on the steel of the very tower he sat before. Once a decorated soldier, then a brilliant entrepreneur. He had built an empire of glass and steel. He owned the tower, the company, the fortune. Yet in this moment, he looked nothing like a titan of industry. He looked like a man forgotten, and it was by design. For today was not about money. It was about truth. For today, he was not testing his company. He was testing his son. Charles's body ached as he pulled the thin coat tighter around his shoulders. Years of service had left scars in his knees and back, but the deeper wounds were hidden, buried in memory. He remembered the battlefield mud, the cries of comrades, the heavy silence of nights where he wondered if he would live to see dawn. Those years had taught him one unshakable lesson. Dignity is not measured by wealth, but by how you treat those who have none. That lesson had built his empire, but lately he feared it had been lost on his only son, Edward. Edward had grown up in penthouses, educated in the finest schools, insulated by chauffeurs and private tutors. He had never known hunger, never felt the sting of cold pavement. Charles had given him everything, perhaps too much. Now the father wondered, had he raised an heir, or had he raised a stranger? The plan had formed quietly in Charles's mind. Disguise himself, shed the armor of wealth, and see what remained in his son's heart when power and privilege were stripped away. If Edward had compassion, he would inherit not only the fortune, but the responsibility. If not, the empire would end with Charles. The mourning dragged on. People passed by, some spared coins, others only judgment. Most pretended not to see him at all. Charles said nothing. He had once stood silent in far harsher places. Silence had been his shield. Now it was his test. By noon, his son appeared. Edward's presence filled the street like thunder. His suit was flawless, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. He walked as though the world were his to command. The employees outside bowed their heads, greeting him with reverence. Charles watched him approach, his heart heavy but hopeful. He whispered again, barely audible, "Spare some change, sir." Edward stopped. At last the test had begun, but instead of compassion, a sneer curled his lips. "Filthy beggar," he muttered, his voice sharp with disdain. "Move away from my building before security drags you off. Oh, this place isn't for people like you." The words landed like blows. For 25 years, Charles had dreamed that his son would inherit not just wealth, but wisdom. Now he heard nothing but emptiness. The silence of bystanders made it worse. No one spoke. No one defended the old man. The world, as always, had turned away from the weak. Charles's chest tightened. This was the cruelty of the test. He could not reveal himself yet. Not here, not now. He remained silent, trembling not from the cold, but from heartbreak. Edward brushed past him, his cologne trailing arrogance, his footsteps echoing like a gavel. Behind him, employees laughed uneasily, relieved to follow power rather than conscience. Charles sat still, the paper cup shaking in his hands. He whispered to himself words that would one day be remembered. Kindness is the only wealth that never runs out. A man without it is already poor. Hours passed. Charles endured the ache of his disguise until evening shadows stretched across the street. Then he rose slowly and disappeared into the building, leaving behind only the paper cup, empty but for a single coin. That night, in the grand dining room of the Whitmore estate, the truth came to light. Edward was summoned, expecting praise, perhaps a new appointment in the company. Instead, he found his father standing tall, clean-shaven, dressed in dignity once more. Edward froze. Recognition dawned too late. The beggar and the billionaire were one and the same. Charles's voice was steady, but every word carried the weight of betrayal. Today I tested you. I stood before you in need, not as your father, but as a man who had nothing, and you gave me nothing. You gave me cruelty. Edward stammered, excuses tumbling out. He thought it was a prank. He didn't recognize him. He was protecting the company's image. But Charles silenced him with a single raised hand. In war, I watched men share their last crust of bread with strangers. In business, I saw leaders rise because they lifted others. And you, my son, could not spare even respect. Tears stung the old man's eyes, but his voice did not falter. Wealth can be built again. Buildings can rise again. But a heart without compassion cannot be rebuilt. It is already broken. The room fell silent. The staff standing at the edges bowed their heads. Some wept quietly. Edward looked around, realizing too late that power meant nothing when respect was gone. Charles turned away, his final words cutting deeper than any punishment. An empire built on cruelty is already ashes, and a son who cannot honor the weak will never inherit the strong. That night, the future of the Whitmore fortune changed. The empire wasn't handed to Edward. Instead, Charles began seeking leaders within his company who showed kindness before ambition, integrity before profit. His fortune would go not to an heir of blood, but to heirs of honor. The story spread quietly at first, whispered in boardrooms and break rooms, until it became a lesson carved into the company's culture. Employees began to treat even the lowest with dignity, remembering the old man who once sat on the pavement to test the worth of compassion. And Edward? He lived with the knowledge that he had failed not only his father, but himself. For the rest of his life, he would remember the day he looked at a man who had given him everything and saw only a beggar. Charles found peace not in wealth, but in truth. His heart was broken, yes, but it was also free. Free from the illusion that money could ever replace humanity. And in his silence, in his disguise, he had given the world a story worth telling. Kindness is the only inheritance worth leaving. Without it, every fortune is worthless. The old man's story reminds us that the way we treat those who seem to have nothing reveals who we truly are. Money can buy respect for a moment, but compassion earns it forever. Where are you watching this story from? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. And if this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more cinematic stories that honor true silent heroes.